All right. Well, we might start making a start. Kia ora koutou. Thanks everyone for joining us today for this Society for Conservation Biology Oceania webinar. We're coming to you live from New Zealand today, and we're going to be celebrating conservation optimism, which is really important for everyone right now, I think, keeping a strong positive mindset and looking towards what we can do. We're going to be joined by two fantastic speakers today. And my name is Natalie Forsdick. I'm Secretary for SCBO. I'm joined by Laura Toro, who is one of our board members as well, and will be chairing the session today. So I'd like to start us off with karakia, as is traditional for New Zealand. Whakataka te hau ki te uru, whakataka te hau ki te tonga. Kia mākina ki uta, kia mātaratara ki tai. E hi ake ana te atakura. He tio, he huka, he hauhu. Tihei moriora. Right, just to start off, introducing the Society for Conservation Biology Oceania for anyone who isn't familiar with who we are. We're a group of conservation professionals from across Oceania. We're a non-profit organisation dedicated to facilitating, promoting and advancing the conservation of biological diversity across Oceania. We've got branches in New Zealand, Australia, Papua New Guinea and Hawaii. And our members include conservation practitioners, researchers, policymakers, and those with broad interests in conserving and enhancing Earth's biodiversity. You can find out more about us, and I'll add a link in the chat to our website. And I'll pass over to Laura to introduce our first speaker for today. Laura.
Thank you, Natalie. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our webinar. Thank you all for coming. We do have two amazing speakers that have been doing some very long-term research on their species, so we're really pleased to have them here with us today. Our first speaker is Jochen Zasmar, and he is a conservation biologist. He has an MSc from Massey University in Auckland, and that MSc is on the ecology of New Zealand's little-known false killer whale population. Jochen is a commercial skipper, and he owns his own research vessel. He is a member of the Far Out Ocean Research Collective, and Jochen began the New Zealand False Killer Whale Research Program in 2005 and has been studying them ever since. He's quite passionate about marine conservation and dedicates much of his time to the promotion of the greater awareness and appreciation of the ocean and its inhabitants. He lives and works in the Bay of Islands. Please welcome me. Please join me in welcoming Jochen.
Hello. Well, thank you.
Jochen.
We're ready to go. Should I? Thank you very much for having me, first of all. And let me just see, I will just share my screen. Here we go. Here we go. Right. Well, thank you very much to the Society for having me, and to everybody else for your interest in false killer whales. And I'll do my very best to cram 20 odd years of false killer whale research into 20 minutes. That will probably fail. I will just start with a general background to false killer whales. If you are unfamiliar with the species, as many people are, the somewhat unfortunate name comes from similarities in skull morphology between the false killer whale and the actual killer whale or orca that you can see there at the bottom. And you can see like they have these same large, really conical teeth. And what happened was that there was a stranding. They found a semi-fossilized skull in the UK in the 1800s, and they thought that it belonged to an extinct ancestor of the killer whale or orca. And then a few years later, there was a stranding, and they realized that it was a different species that was, still alive and well. And as is often the case in science, the name stuck, and we're sort of stuck with it now. Unfortunately, it's not a great name. False killer whales are found in all the world's oceans. They prefer warmer, deep oceanic waters, and they have a low density usually, so they're uncommon anywhere within their range. And as you can sort of see on that map there in New Zealand, we're very much at the limit of their preferred natural range, and so it's quite an interesting area to study them because they do things slightly differently here in New Zealand than they do in the tropics where most of the populations reside. False killer whales they're long-lived and slow to reproduce. Females will live into their 60s, males into their late 50s. They reach sexual maturity around about the age of 10 for the females, but males mature up to 10 years later than the females, around about 18 or 20. They have long calving intervals, so they will only have a calf about every 7 to 8 years. And females go through menopause in their 40s, which means that a female will only really have 4 or 5 calves within her lifetime, which is not a lot. And that, together with with their low numbers, has some conservation implications. You can tell them apart. There is sexual dimorphism between the males and the females. However, for those of you who are familiar with cetaceans, normally you can sex cetaceans by the mammary slits of the females, and false killer whales are the one exception where the males have them too. So that makes it really difficult to actually sex false killer whales, but there are some natural indicators you can use. You can see on the right the males, so once they physically mature, they have this really large protruding melon. However, it takes about 18 to 20 years for that to actually happen. So for the first 15 years or so, we generally don't know whether they're male or female. Males are also quite a bit larger. They grow to about 6 meters and females to about 4.5 meters. And as you can see there on the right, the male, they're a lot bulkier, so they've got quite a bit more girth. Starting with some of the negative before I carry on with all the positive stuff about false killer whales, they are one of the problem species globally when it comes to fishery interactions. We know from the work being done in Hawaii, where they've done excellent research. We know that they are populations there are declining because of fishery interactions, and there's indications that is really happening across the species range. So they're one of those whale species that will take fishes, in particular of long lines, so they feed on tuna, and it's fair to assume that populations anywhere across the range that frequently interact with fisheries are declining. Luckily, in New Zealand, so these photos are actually from New Zealand, so we do have some fishery interactions here, but luckily it appears that the rate of that is significantly lower than in other parts of the world. Another issue with false killer whales is misidentification between that rather unfortunate name and their looks, which are similar to other so-called blackfish species like pilot whales and melon-headed whales. They often get misidentified, and the problem there is that, especially when it comes to bycatch, that we may be losing false killer whales at unsustainable rates, and we don't even know that it's happening because they get identified as something else. So this here is an example from a video that some of you may remember from a few years ago that Greenpeace ran, alerting sort of bycatch mortality, and they called it a pilot whale when it really was a false killer whale. So that's just one of the issues, and it's part of what we do is to raise awareness so people know that they actually exist and what they are. Historically, most of what we have known about false killer whales comes from mass stranding. So they're one of those species will strand in large numbers. We had a mass stranding here in New Zealand last year, and there was one in Australia and Tasmania just recently. And most of our knowledge used to come from that. However, luckily, we do have some dedicated long-term projects now. So the Hawaiians really lead the way there. They have an excellent research program that's been going for 25 years or more. And we've been at it here in New Zealand for just over 20 years. And there's new projects have been popping up in Australia and Japan and the Azores. So we're really learning a lot more about them now in their natural habitat at sea. And it's really interesting because they do things differently in different places. So I will shed some light on our New Zealand population. When we started our work 20 odd years ago, we really didn't know much about false killer whales at all. So, they're one of those little known species, and they still are, and even more so then. So we started with the basics, which is like, where do you actually get false killer whales in New Zealand? And I know there's quite a bit going on this map here, but without going into too much detail, you can see that there's a lot more going on around the North Island, and that ties in with what we know about false killer whales, that they prefer these warm waters, so it makes sense that there are more strandings and sightings around there. So the blue squares are the sighting locations, and the yellow circles are strandings. And if you have a look at the bottom there, South Island, you see that thick blue line, that is the subtropical convergence, which is the cold front. And it appears that acts like a natural barrier for them, where they rarely seem to cross it. So there's not many records at all from the South Island. And then at the opposite end there on the North Island, you see that red line, that is the East Auckland current. That is a warm current that comes from the subtropics, and it brings this nice warm water from the Coral Sea into that area between North Cape and East Cape during summer and autumn, and that's where we really have most of our sightings, and that's where most of our work is sort of based on too. So this is just a zoom into really our research area. So we're based up in the Bay Islands, so you can see there's a lot of sightings there. And really 95% of our sightings are from that area. So we've had a few West Coast sightings and like a few South Island ones too. But they seem to really like this warm water. And like I said, it's kind of what you would expect from a warm water species. However, what we did find after 20 years of research is that false killer whales enter coastal waters of New Zealand in early summer, around about December, and then they stay for about 4 to 5 months. And sometime around April, they depart again, and then the same whales return every year. And which is interesting, because they're really not supposed to do that. They're supposed to be these offshore whales. And initially, we thought that there would just be occasional forays into coastal waters, and then they would go out into deep waters again, where they should be. But instead, what was happening is that we have this sort of seasonal strong site fidelity in shallow shelf water. So this is here for those of you from New Zealand. So this is Aotearoa, Great Barrier Island there in the background, and here is just off the beach at Mangawhai. And they will come into really shallow waters, like water depths of less than 10 meters occasionally, and then feed on coastal fish species. We then looked at other natural markers to see how much time they're actually spending inshore. And a good way to do that is the cookie cutter shark. It's a rather horrific looking critter there that you can see on the left there. It's a parasitic shark. They're very small. They're only about 60 centimeters long, and they take these chunks out of their prey, and they operate kind of, it's like an ice cream scoop. So they take this sort of like a chunk of blubber or flesh about the size of like half a tennis ball out of their prey, which leaves these deep wounds that then heal over the course of several weeks. And the cookie cutter sharks live in deep and warm oceanic waters, so you can deduct that any animal that bears those scars must at least at some point also venture into these deep warm oceanic waters. And so we did the analysis on all our encounters, and the results are really conclusive. Where like all the early season encounters, we have the false killer whales are covered in these cookie cutter bites, and then they don't acquire any new ones while they're here. And then towards the end of the season, in April or May, they start to have the first scars again. So which suggests that they really spend the whole summer and autumn in shallow waters, in like continental shelf waters. And then towards the end of their stay here, there's a bit of an inshore offshore movement, and then they're gone. And we still don't really know where they actually go, but at least we can sort of pinpoint them somewhere north of here, somewhere deeper and warmer, basically. And we also now know from some stable isotope analysis that Catherine Meyer is doing at the University of Auckland under the supervision of Rochelle Constantine and Emma Carroll, that there is a seasonal difference in diet. So they do eat different things in summer compared to winter. So we think what is happening there is that this seasonality is really that they come into New Zealand waters because it gives them access to a food source within their preferred temperature range, because they do like this warm water. And globally, false killer whales really feed on a large variety of large fish like tuna, but also squid. And we're seeing that here in New Zealand too. However, it appears that they target large schools of fish. So here you see one with a kingfish tail in its mouth. They also feed on snapper and schools of kahawai. And like I said earlier, so we just think that so this is food that we wouldn't normally encounter, in those deep oceanic waters where they normally are. And so they really make the most of the seasonal productivity of the shelf waters of New Zealand summer seas. We then wanted to take it one step further. So, we looked at the species level, and early on, we realized that we were seeing the same individuals repeatedly. And so we used a well-known process called photo identification, which many of you will be familiar with. So you can identify individuals by the nicks and notches of their fins, their dorsal fins, and false killer whales are particularly useful species for that because they have a high mark rate. So over 80% of them are identifiable, which is great for us because you can then really do some robust analysis. And what we found was that there was only 150 individuals, that come into our coastal waters during summer and autumn, and then go away. But the same individuals, like clockwork, return every year. And they're grouped into these two large groups, which we call social clusters. So you got an example here. So this is what we call social cluster 1, and there's about 85 whales in this picture here. And so this is a stable group, so these whales will stay in that formation for their entire lives. The only variable there is that some of the adult males may move between groups. But other than that, these groups are super stable, which also makes finding them really hard because it's like an all or nothing thing. So you kind of, you can't just look for like two of them because they stay in these groups very reliably. And just I hope this is not too confusing for you guys. But so this is the sociogram, and that just shows you the two different clusters. The blue nodes are cluster 1, the yellow ones are cluster 2, and really the takeaway here is that you can see all those lines, so you can see like these whales are super connected. So all the whales we've ever identified at sea in New Zealand are linked by association on the social network. So we haven't come across any others yet, although we know that there are some others, and I'll talk about that in a moment. And then if you're wondering why there is a yellow node there at the bottom, number 75, so that is one of those males that may be seen with either of those two groups. But other than that, really, like for all we know, there's only these two groups of whales that come into our coastal waters for summer and autumn, feed extensively, and then leave again in April or May, and then return again the next year. So that was a really cool finding. I mentioned the others, so we know that there are others. So we had this really sad event last year. We had a mass stranding at Mahia Peninsula on the east coast of the North Island. 41 individuals, which sadly all died. And when we did the necropsies there, we could already see instantly from the photo identification that those animals were new to us. We had never seen them before. And then Catherine Meyer did the genetic analysis, and it showed that these whales were not related to those two groups at all. And not only that, it was a new haplotype. So these whales are not related to any other false killer whale anywhere in the world that we know of. So that tells us that there are at least two or probably more populations in our waters, and some of them that we know nothing about, but they don't appear to mix, and that has important conservation implications, because even though we may have larger numbers than those 150, they don't appear to interact very much. Yeah, and that brings me to probably the most intriguing aspect of false killer whales in New Zealand, and that is associations with oceanic bottlenose dolphins. So these false killer whales form long-term relationships with bottlenose dolphins, and you can see them here. So this is the oceanic ecotype. They're quite a bit larger, darker, and really robust, and they've got this sort of stubby, short rostrum, or they look quite different to the coastal ones. And 95% of our records show the two species together, and that includes 100% of our sightings. So I have never seen false killer whales without bottlenose dolphins in New Zealand in 25 years of researching them. And that begs the obvious question as to like, well, why is that? One of the main drivers we think is food, where the two species appear to work together quite actively to find food, and then once they find it, to also sort of herd it. And just to give you sort of the picture that we see when we're out there, so you have these 85 whales, and sometimes if you have both clusters together, you can have well over 100 whales together with hundreds of these bottlenose dolphins, and they're spread out for many, many miles when they travel around down the coast. In search of these large schools of fish, and we think one of the reasons why they team up is they can spread out, and it really increases the radius of their search area. And when they encounter prey, then these groups contract, and they come together and actively work to drive these fish into these balls. And you can see that here they use different techniques. So you can see at the bottom there, you've got the dolphins that swim underneath the schools, and they swim belly up. So they use the white of their belly to flash the fish towards the surface. The false killers use a slightly different technique. They swim under the schools, and they use these upstrokes with their tails. But they seem to be quite coordinated when they do that. And when we looked at the photo identification, we found that not only are the whales always the same, but many of the dolphins are also the same. So bottlenose dolphins have quite a different social structure. They live in these sort of fish infusion societies. So whenever we see them, there's always lots of dolphins that we haven't seen before, but about half of them we have seen before, and in many cases going back up to 20 years, which makes it plausible that these whales and dolphins probably recognize each other. At least we can show that the same individuals see each other repeatedly over decades. So it's a really intriguing scenario there. Another driver that we think might be behind this association is the avoidance of predators. Many of you will be familiar with this event here. So this happened in the Bay of Islands in 2010, where a group of false killer whales and bottlenose dolphins got attacked by these offshore killer whales. And the presumed mother, the female there that's been thrown into the air, she actually survived, but her calf there got eaten. So the idea there is that by joining up, they create what's called a dilution effect. So it's basically the increase in numbers makes it less likely for an individual to be attacked, and it also gives everyone a higher chance to detect the predator. So it's a basic safety in numbers thing. Although unfortunately in this case it didn't work for them. But yeah, so killer whales are known predators for both species, so they might benefit from their association. The other one is then so-called social factors. We know that the species spend a lot of time together, including really close physical contact, as you can see here, and interparental, interspecific parental care. So you can see in the foreground here is a female false killer whale with her presumed calf, and then next to that you have a adult bottlenose dolphin acting as an escort. And it's really it's difficult to really how to interpret these complex scenarios, but you have another example here with a false killer whale with a little dolphin. But at the very least, it suggests that there is a great level of trust and familiarity between these two species, and given that we can show how much time they spend together, they're very used to each other's presence. Yeah, so I'm kind of I made it in just about 20 minutes. So I just wanted to say that it really this is the work is ongoing, but it started off as a citizen science project, and in many ways it really is, because we couldn't do any of this work without the help from the public. So as you saw earlier, we're looking for two groups of whales along hundreds of kilometers of coastline. So what we had to do to make this work is get everybody involved. So we started off with this hotline, and we've got a Facebook page, and it's really taken off. So as you can sort of see here, these are like the sighting reports that we got in the beginning, like over the years, and in many years we'd see them once or twice. If we had 5 encounters in a year, that'd be really good. And now in more recent years, we can be up to 50 encounters per season. So these days, most weeks we've got a pretty good idea where these whales actually are, which is pretty amazing, given that there's not many of them, and but one of the challenges we still have, like I said, is this misidentification, where people don't really know what they are. and what they're looking for. But that is really changing now, and we're really pleased to that people are aware of what false killer whales are now. We had to, and this is a beautiful illustration here by Sean Lee. So I was really pleased with that. So that sort of it's just they're getting recognition now for the ecosystem services they provide for in the Hauraki Gulf here, for example. And then they're also featured in a few documentaries now. So we had the New Zealand false killer whales in the Blue Planet 2 series, and most recently in the mammals episode from the BBC. And if you haven't seen that, you should. It's just amazing footage. And so increasingly people know what false killer whales are, and they tell us about it. So and in many ways, even though we've been at it for 20 years, it feels like we're really only just getting started. So with that, I made it in 22 minutes. So thank you very much, and I will just stop sharing my screen.
Thank you, Jochen. Amazing talk. I learned a lot, and I have a bunch of questions. So let's save our questions to the end. And now we're going to go along to our next speaker. And we have Gaia Dell'Ariccia. And Gaia has been studying seabirds for quite a while. She is, excuse me, she's a senior ecologist with the Auckland Council, and she's a seabird scientist at the Council's Environmental Evaluation and Monitoring Unit, and she's very passionate about her seabirds, and she has completed a PhD in bird behavior at the University of Zurich, Switzerland, and she began studying seabirds in 2007, traveling to different seabird islands all around the world. And now she is with the Auckland Council, and we're quite happy to have her. And she's now leading Auckland Council Regional Seabird Monitoring and Research Program, and she's been doing that for the last 6 years. So we'd like to hand over to Gaia now for her presentation.
Yeah, all right. Thank you, Laura, for the nice introduction. I am going to share my screen. Hope that you can see it. So I'm really happy today to be here to present the work that I've been doing, as you said, for the last 6 years. And why we need a seabird program in Auckland for the Auckland Council? Well, because the Hauraki Gulf, Te Kapa Moana, it's recognized internationally for the incredible biodiversity and amount of species of seabirds that breed here, 27, but also that are endemic or local endemic, meaning that we find them nowhere else in the world and just on our islands and our mainland. But unfortunately, when we look at their conservation status, we see that pretty all of them are threatened at different level, which picture a quite bad situation. Unfortunately, we know that the seabirds are the most threatened category of birds because they suffer from habitat loss, from the introduction of mammalian predators, especially here in New Zealand and on offshore islands, but also they are impacted by fisheries, pollution, climate change. And unfortunately, though, despite this situation, in the past, they've been rarely managed. This because they are very difficult to monitor. They are on offshore islands. Most of them nest underground or are nocturnal, so are actually easy to see. And they have very long lifespan and breeding times, meaning that they need years of data. Luckily enough, at the end of 2018, Auckland Council set a natural environment target rate on Auckland, across Auckland properties. Basically, it was a way to have a budget for environmental protection and restoration of indigenous biodiversity. Among a huge number of projects that were funded with these rates was a tiny budget that was allocated to the creation of a seabird monitoring and regional program, seabird monitoring research program, that it's a first for a local government in New Zealand and probably across the world, which is already in itself a big win for the protection of seabirds. And the program has three main objectives. One is to understand where the birds are and how many they are across the region. What are the factors and that affects their population and the threats that they face? And also which are the most effective actions that we can take to restore ecosystem and biodiversity. As we needed to work on all the species that you saw before and across the whole region, we had to go through our prioritization process, but we managed to start a big number of monitoring and research projects. And here you see the species that we are monitoring, that we've been monitoring in the last 6 years, and all the sites across the region that you see, they span both from islands in the Hauraki Gulf and the mainland, only the Waitakere, but also across, for example, the whole region for what it's shags that we are trying to map. Unfortunately, I don't have time to present you for every single project that we are carrying out, but I pick a few one with the team of Conservation Optimism. So even we are, facing a biodiversity crisis, there's still good stories to tell. And so let's start from the positive news. And the first, I think, most example is those of the white-faced storm petrels on Maria Island. White-faced storm petrels within the region breed in only two places, Maria Island and Borges, Pocohino up north. Maria, at the end of the 1950s, was unfortunately invaded by Norway rats that almost wiped out completely the population of storm petrels that was breeding over there. And a group of school children from Waiheke realized that and decided, thanks to the teacher, to start a poisoning program. And with the support of the New Zealand Wildlife Services, in 1964, Maria was declared predator-free. I have here a picture. You see how small it is. It's 2-hectare islands. And it's the first island in New Zealand, and so very likely in the world, that was declared predator-free and where rats were removed. This allowed white-faced storm petrel to recover, but no one has really looked into it to see, okay, how many are they? And so we went there and started to do it. And so we went nest monitoring. The picture on the left of your screen is with a tiny boroscope, that is a camera that goes inside the burrows and check for breeding birds. You can see a bird sitting on its huge egg. And then we wanted to know how many birds are there. And to do this, we use a method that is called capture mare capture. Basically, we set mist nets at night, that are these nets that you see here during the night. We capture the birds, we mark them, which is basically banding the birds, and release them immediately. With several, year after year, we go and capture the birds again, and by the proportion of birds that need to be banded and those that we recapture, we can do an estimate of the population. But first, I want to show you how busy are at night now. This is how the night looks like there. This is the picture is Matt Ryan from Auckland Museum that we are collaborating with. And already for the images here, you can see that nights are pretty busy and intense work. And here we have just a few numbers of the birds that we managed to capture. The increasing numbers is just because every year we increase the efforts in capturing the birds, and we could have recaptured. And this is a preliminary result, but we can tell that around 7,000 white-faced storm petrels are on the island now, both including breedings, non-breeders, juveniles that come back to inspect the island, which is amazing on 2 hectares island. It's very small. These birds are not safe for everything because, for example, in early 2023, with all the storms, after the Auckland flood, this is how the chicks look like. This was after the Auckland anniversary flood and before Cyclone Gabrielle that hits just 2 weeks afterwards. We could find only 5 chicks on the whole island, and they all looked in quite poor conditions. So there's still a lot of challenges to save the birds for which we need to find solution and to tackle these threats. But let's move to another iconic species, that is the takoketai or taiko, the black petrel, because this is an endemic to the Auckland region. And the main colony is on Aotearoa, Great Barrier Island, on the top of Irakimata, that is the red area that you see in this map, and where Wildlife Management International and BISBEL has been monitoring for 29 years now. But the other colony on Hauturu, that it's about 500, maybe 600 pairs, has been monitored just very sporadically, sometimes a bit in the 70s, 80s, and by BISBEL again more recently, but just for a couple of years. So we basically have no idea how the birds are doing there. And as Aotearoa is not predator free, and there are pigs that if they go at the main colony, they basically could wipe out all the birds in one go, it's very important to understand what's the population on Aotearoa, in a way to say not to have all the eggs in one basket, or in this case, not to have all the eggs on one single island. So we started monitoring. Here we have a map of all the burrows that you see out of the top ridge of the island. They include both old burrows and new that we found. And after 3 years of monitoring, we have a few numbers here, but I would be very fast in telling you. The problem is that we had an extremely low breeding occupancy. We were very, very worried. As you see, we don't even reach 30% of these burrows that include the old ones that were occupied. And comparing to the previous data, we see, gosh, the population is really go down. It was low, but it's going even lower. And again, we have the data of breeding success for the 2023 summer, and this number 66.7%, it's in March. That is 2 months before fledging, meaning that 2 months before fledging, or 35% of the chicks had already died. We were in full depression and say, oh my God, on Hauturu, that is one of the most protected areas in New Zealand, these birds are really doing bad. But then we kept monitoring, and the following year, we can see the numbers that are starting to go up. And this year, spoiler, the number are still higher. I don't know the breeding success because we will be there next week to look for chicks. So what does data tell us? First of all, it's a confirmation that we need long-term data monitoring. With these long-living birds, if we monitor for just short time, we will drop into yearly variations. And so we cannot really say if the population is doing well or not until we have a proper amount of number of years of monitoring. But also, again, unfortunately, that all these species are very sensitive to weather events. And this is something that we really should try to tackle as best as we can in the future. Keeping on black petrels, a very small thing on Aotearoa. We are also monitoring at the Glenfinch Sanctuary. That is actually where I am right now checking for black petrel chicks. We started doing the monitoring here just a few years ago. And again, we had a situation where of the burrows that knew of both black petrels and Cook's petrels, only very few were occupied. So we asked for help for the real and only expert of seabird detection. That is Miro, the dog, with his handler, Joe Singh. Miro is a seabird detector dog, and is the way he wanders around the bush. And then when he finds a burrow, he just points at the hole saying there's something there. And as you can see in this case, we found a wonderful black petrel chick. And so he's been helping us detecting more burrows of both black petrels and Cook's petrels. And the numbers that we find are still low in the sanctuary, but are way better than what we were thinking before, highlighting the great potential of restoration in this area that I forgot to say. It's a sanctuary, so there is a predator fence and high predator control inside, so it could really create a safe haven for these birds within Aotearoa. The last thing I want to talk to you about, it's other things we have been trying, is how can we innovate seabird monitoring? We are used to go out, look for nests, check for borers, capture birds, and try to see the numbers, how they vary. But there's more that it can be done. And this is a study that was conducted by my colleague, Myra Fesadi, that she works in the program with me for her master's, and is, can feather indicate us the health and predict breeding success of the birds? She's been working with gray-faced petrels that are very abundant. And you can see in these pictures, gray-faced petrel, they are gray as it tells the thing, but they are generally quite dark, as you can see in the image on your right, while the left one, the feathers appear discolored and very light. It's like for us, if we are unhealthy, we are not well nourished, our hair start to be opaque and fall down and don't look great. Well, birds' feathers looks exactly the same. And what she found was exactly what we were hoping for. So as you see here, that healthier parents that are in good physical conditions actually produce chicks that have better feathers. So feathers can predict the health both of parents and chicks, but also that the feathers quality in the parents can tell us, can predict breeding success, meaning that adults with good feathers have higher chances of fledging chicks, of being successful in their breeding, than adults with bad feathers, which on the contrary are much more likely to fail in their breeding. This means that yes, feathers can be a monitoring tool and then can help us, because getting feathers from birds, it's a relatively easy and low impact measure and method. And basically, if we found good feathers, meaning that everything gets fine and great. If we found low quality feathers, this is a ring bell for us that something is going wrong and that we need to inspect more and try to find out what is going on. This is, of course, just the beginning. And it's one of the many projects that, as you can see, we are carrying out. We are trying to expand it and to understand how feathers, for example, we can detect contamination with heavy metals or stress and physiology, stress hormones by the feathers. And here there's a long list, a set of all other projects that we are carrying out with many different collaborators. And last thing, it's what do we do with the data? So we collect a lot of data and monitoring, and then we use those for example, we just produced the regional threat classification for all birds in Auckland, including all bird species, not just seabirds, but we identify, for example, the pressures, or we are working today in identifying what are the biodiversity focus areas that we absolutely need to manage and protect to restore birds' places and protect our seabirds. There is a big status environment reporting about to come out, but also then we can predict future changes and inform management and help in valuation of marine protection and so on. To conclude, as with the theme for today was conservation optimism, I want to conclude with a quote by Christiana Figueres about stubborn optimism. They say, it's not the result of a success. It is the necessary input for addressing any challenge if we want a chance of success. Stubborn optimism is not blind to realities. It's not oblivious of the hard facts. Stubborn optimism is a choice, a deliberate mindset. And so today, I really hope that we all keep an optimist point of view and we keep working, because this is the only way that we can achieve what we want for protection. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gaia. Lovely talk. It's so interesting about the feathers. That's a great idea. And like you said, low impact. And yes, I'm a stubborn optimist. And yes, in these challenging times, I think it's very important to have hope for the future. So thank you for that talk. I would like now to open up everything to questions. We can have questions for Jochen first. and then questions for Gaia. So folks, turn on your microphones, perhaps raise your hands, and we'd love to see your faces as well. Go ahead.
Max, did you want to kick off? Max sent me a question in the chat for Jochen. Or I'm happy to read it out. So Max asks, or Max says, 7 to 8 year calving interval seems quite large at first glance. Any idea as to why or what benefit this might have to the animals?
Yes, great question. It is quite large. It is, however, comparable to killer whales and also pilot whales. And we think the reason for that is that they basically have very high parental investment. So there's a very long learning period where the calf like needs to learn everything from its mother. So yeah, it's like I said, it's the same in killer whales. So it makes them vulnerable to impact, because they just don't, they don't have that many calves in their lifetime. But it's like historically, it's a strategy that pays off because these by the time the next calf comes around, those calves have learned a lot, so are ready to be good false killer whales basically.
Awesome. Max has one more question and then we'll come to Alistair. Max also asks, is there recreational fishing pressures that affects the false killer whales in Auckland and Bay of Islands?
Not, we don't know is the answer. So like you saw those early pictures, and we definitely there is some impact from interaction. So we have some individuals with line cuts and also with these gape cuts. So the gape cut is probably more more telling than a line than a fin cut because there's nothing else that can create a gape cut than a fish hook really. But we don't know whether they come from commercial fisheries or from recreational fisheries. We don't even know whether they acquire them in New Zealand waters or in winter when they presumably go offshore. So all we can do is just monitor them, and luckily there hasn't been a big increase in them. So there are some. We also presume that they will sometimes just take fish off, in particular game fishermen, just because of the fish that they target, as prey they like. But luckily, it appears to be at a much lower level than in Hawaii, for example, where it's a real problem.
Cool, thank you. We'll pass to Alistair.
Laura, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, Kapai. Jochen, I've got a question for Jochen and one for Gaia. Jochen, I'm just wondering with the false killer whale name, whether there's a Te Reo Maori name used kind of consistently for them, because down here it might be nice to use that given the rather unpalatable English name.
It is, and there is, and it's Mautai. And I was going to use it, however, there seems to be some disagreement as to where that name is used.
Might be regional, right? So
yeah, it is.
Okay, thanks. Yeah. And Gaia, I was wondering, that feather work is fascinating, and I'm just wondering if it's already used in other bird species, or what you might think about whether we could use that. Obviously might need proof of concept for other species, but what do you think about the applicability?
This is where we are now, meaning Myra managed to prove it for grey-faced petrel, and now we are in a stage that basically every single species that we monitoring, we are collecting feathers, and we need to do all the tests to see the applicability and the reliability for all other species. So it's still a work in progress, but we are going exactly there to be able to use it for other species as well.
Right, thanks. And thanks, Jochen. Great talks, both of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks for your interest. I also had a question for Jochen about the feeding behaviours. So I've seen lots of videos of orcas recently stunning their prey with the tail. Is that the same? I know you talked a little bit about how they were coming up underneath the school of fish. Are they also using the tail to stun their prey?
So not that we know of. So they usually just use this sort of herding technique to round these fish into balls. And I think because they go into sort of, I mean, I know that like killer whales, orca will do it, when they round up like herring schools and they whack them with the tails. And we don't seem to see that much. I think it's just because even kahawai are still reasonably large, that they can sort of just pick a single one out as long as they have them penned into these tight schools. Interestingly, what they also do, like what I didn't have time to show you, is with the larger fish, in particular kingfish, they're quite fussy eaters. So they'll take one and they'll gut them, they'll rip the head off and pull the head out, and then all the entrails go with it, and they discard that. And then one will hold the kingfish, and all the others, like several others, will come and take little chunks of it. So there's a strong social function to their feeding.
Wow, that's cool. Big dinner party.
Yeah.
Do we have any more questions from the floor?
I have a question for Yakin. So you said that they prefer the warm water and they're here seasonally in your study area. Do we know where they are when they're not here?
The short answer is no, and I wish we did. So all we do know is that, from like the cookie cutter scars that I mentioned, and also from the stable isotope work, is that they go into deeper, warmer waters, which is kind of what you would expect. And we do think, because like I don't think that they're going as far as the tropics, for example, because it's just not productive enough for them. So, because it's highly likely that they stay in these large groups, like, all the time, because the same whales come back in the same group formation every year. So to sustain these groups, I think they're gonna go. If I had to put money on, I would put them somewhere, maybe around the Kermadex. So I think they're very likely to stay in that sort of 19 to 23 degree temperature bands, and that's sort of where it would put them, in winter. But then, for all we know, they could maybe just go over to the west coast, and we would never really know because there's very little observer effort over there. And interestingly, this year, for the first time ever, cluster one that we normally see all the time, they've spent the whole summer on the west coast for the first time that we know of. And it's just, it's a great testament to having a sighting network, because we would have never known if people hadn't sort of reported them and sent us videos. So we had a pretty good idea as to where they were. It was frustrating because we couldn't get to them. But yeah, so there's a lot of unknowns, So I mean, just it's yeah, but presumably they go somewhere deeper and warmer. But when we're hoping to one day, be able to, find out where exactly, and maybe even go and study them there in winter and see what they get up to. Also to see whether they're actually still together with the dolphins in winter. That's another interesting question.
Do we have a number of the entire population in New Zealand?
We don't. So beyond these 150, we really don't know. Like I said, we know that there are others, but we also know that most of the others are not related to these two groups. But then the genetics show that these two groups, cluster 1 and 2, that we see all the time, share a South-Pacific haplotype. And Catherine Meyer is literally, as we speak, just analyzing the samples to see whether there is like current gene flow or whether those were like historic events. So we're super interested to see what's happening there. And and it's complex as always. So like all these groups have that same haplotype, but then there are a couple of there's one female, for example, with a totally different haplotype. So they're it's never cast in stone. So there is some immigration into those clusters at very low levels from other populations. And we also found that in Hawaii, even though they treat them as a close population, technically they aren't, but it's so minor. But yeah, lots of questions still, basically.
And one last one, sorry. The interspecific associations that you're recording, like those guys in Hawaii, Robin Beard, for example, are they also seeing their false killer whales hanging out with bottlenose dolphins and foraging together?
No, they don't, and you wouldn't really expect it from the tropics, because I think it's really an adaptation to making the most of these seasonally productive seas. So in Hawaii, for example, the groups are much smaller, and that kind of makes sense because they're really feeding on single large fish like yellowfin tuna, for example. So you wouldn't really want like 50 whales, so it's much more conducive to the foraging to have smaller groups, and then they tackle one fish and they share that. Whereas in New Zealand, for them to sort of really make the most of these schools of fish, I think it works for both species, to achieve this increase in numbers. And then it will be interesting to see whether they're still together in winter. Now, some of them don't think so, because otherwise you would expect, because if they really rely on these, larger numbers all the time, it would just make more sense for there to be just more whales, than for the two species to team up. And the stable isotope suggests that in winter they feed more on squid, and with the squid, they'll dive deep for those, and then they wouldn't really be very cooperative doing that. They really need this sort of mutually beneficial hunting technique to tackle these schools of kahawai and kingfish. So yeah, sorry, it's a lot.
That's awesome.
Cool. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Yeah, we've got some more questions in the chat for you, Jochen, but
Cool.
I'm just going to throw to Gaia really quickly so that she doesn't feel too left out over there. And then we'll come back to Michelle's questions. Gaia, I was really interested in seeing the sniffer dog at work. How often are you able to work with a sniffer dog, and are there particular islands that is like the standard practice these days, or is it a real rare event?
It depends, meaning that it's not the regular money. We employ the dog when we need to find burrows, and then we start regular monitoring, say, okay, this is where they are. And so we start monitoring. But for example, so we used here in Glenfern, and the dog came here, I think, 3 times in the last 2 years, because of course the dogs could come for a few days. And so we had different areas targeting more black petrels, or just last February for cooks mainly. So it's quite amazing. And we went also to Meadlands again in Aotearoa, also on Great Barrier. Or, for example, now again on the noises, on Otata, that is the bigger of the noises, we have all our monitoring for grey-faced petrel and penguins. And we decided that we don't have enough penguins. Penguins don't look great at the moment, and we want. So our first step is, let's bring the dog and see if we are just missing them on the islands. And that's really the first step, because there's no better than the dog to find them. It's impressive. You just follow and it's there. And so it's a very, very useful, I don't want to call him tool, but it's it's a companion and colleague of work. He's amazing.
That's so awesome.
Yeah, in islands where it's not possible to do regular monitoring, or areas of difficult access in the middle of the bush, it's the best way to detect burrows.
Fantastic, thanks. All right, back to you, Jochen. So Michelle's got a series of questions. This one sort of follows on a little bit from the last bit that you were talking about with Laura. How closely are they related to bottlenose dolphins, given their close interactions?
Well, they're not very closely related at all. But however, having said that, they can produce hybrids. And not only that, but they can actually produce viable hybrids. So far this has only happened in captivity. So not only can they produce a hybrid, and bottlenose dolphins can produce hybrids with quite a few different species. So they seem to be sort of one of those intermediate species. But the interesting thing, so this happened at a place called Marineland in Hawaii, an aquarium in Hawaii, and so they had a hybrid between a bottlenose dolphin and the false killer whale. But then the offspring, which they named the wolphin, then had a calf. So which is not really supposed to happen. So it was interesting, and we think we have definitely seen some dolphins sometimes in there that look like they could have some false killer whale in them. Just from the fin shape, and sometimes they have these really short rostrums. But we have, short of doing some genetic sampling, you really can't tell. But as a species of false killer whales are really part of the blackfish species, so they're closely related to pilot whales, melon-headed whales, pygmy killer whales, and also the Risso's dolphin actually is probably the closest relative. So yeah, so they're in that called globicephalids, they're called, so that group. Yeah.
That's super interesting to me. I have a background in hybridization, so
Okay.
very, very cool. Michelle also is interested to know about whether offshore food availability may be impacting their choice to stay close inshore.
Um, yes, it will, but I don't. I think it's a natural process, though. So I don't think, I don't think at this stage it's probably not driven by like by human fishing pressure. I think it's probably something that they've always done. It's just because you have this increased productivity in shelf waters, and these whales are really they're just specializing in it, and it's quite interesting because it's an interesting conservation management question because it's really like it looks like it's a behavioral aspect of a subset of a larger population where these guys, and they've just decided to do that, and it's also brings back to the long calving intervals. So these whales have just learned to do that. And so that's what they do, and once they do something, like, it has to go wrong quite badly for them to change their behavior, because they've just learned that from their mothers, and that's what they've been doing all their lives, and they're very reliable. So I think it's just easy foraging for them in winter, but I think they're temperature driven. I think they just don't like cold water, which is why you get very few of them south of East Cape. So yes, it's just more abundant waters and more abundant prey for them during summer here.
Cool. And a very interesting question, which might be our final one. Do we know if they have any grey matter in their brains?
Well, we know they're very smart. So we know that they've done like mirror testing with them in captivity, and so we know that they can recognize their image in the mirror, for example. So they're kind of up there with killer whales, some bird species, or so. They're very, yeah, they've got a great sort of cognitive ability, and when we work with them in the field, you often, you can sort of see that they're often very interested in what we do. Even when we take biopsy samples, sometimes they'll come right back and they'll have a look at the biopsy dart and they'll inspect it and they want to know exactly what's happening. They also food share with humans. They've tried to give us fish in the past, and then they'll watch you and see what you do with it. So yeah, they're pretty clever animals.
That's awesome. I've learned so much today from both of you. Fantastic stuff. All right, if there's no last questions, I'm going to just make a little bit of promo on behalf of the Society. So yeah, once again, thank you to our two fantastic speakers today. It's been really great to have you along, and it's been really great to have a really interested audience with lots of questions. So thanks for that. Once again, if you're interested in finding out more about who we are and what we do, you can head to our website at www.scboceania.org. And along with the things that we do, we have an affiliated journal, which is Pacific Conservation Biology. It's dedicated to conservation and wildlife management across the Pacific, and SCBO members benefit from a 40% discount on personal subscriptions to that journal. There's lots of really interesting publications that come out all of the time in that one, and obviously there's open access publication opportunities there. We encourage members to consider PCB as an avenue for publication. And just another thing coming up on our radar, we are co-hosting the International Congress for Conservation Biology in Brisbane this coming June, very, very soon coming up. We're co-hosting this alongside the Society for Conservation Biology Global. And so we're expecting a lot of people from all over the world coming together to talk about conservation and all kinds of research and all kinds of practice that's going on out there. Registrations are still open, and we look forward to seeing some of you there. And to close, I'd like to close with a karakia. Kia whakairia te tapu, kia wātea ai te ara, kia turuki whakataka ai, kia turuki whakataka ai. Haumie, huie, taekie. Thanks everyone. We'll see you next time.